Hello students, happy Thursday or Friday, depending on when you're watching this video, to get your next assignment for history done. This week we only had 2. So what I want you to do is I would like you to pull out your assignment of the rudiments of history. This one. This is history 2. Okay? The rudiments of history. What are rudiments? The rudiments are the foundational subjects, the origins of the subject. So we're going to go over the rudiment of history. Number 1, let's review a little bit from your other pages. So God works in what 4 ways does God work? Let me look at my notes so I can make sure I get them right. Just a reminder, when we're studying history, it's more of how God is working, okay? God is superintending, God is overseeing, God is disposing, and God is overruling in the lives of men and nations. Remember, he has one plan, which is to spread the gospel or bring the advancement of the gospel. He has one Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, and he has one goal for liberty to the individual. Now, we're going to see through history that liberty is not just internal, but it is also something that is external. Still going? You know what? I put my phone on Do Not Disturb because the other day, I was like 6 minutes into a video and someone called and it restarted my video. So that's that pause there. I apologize for that. But he has one goal, which is internal liberty. Now, liberty starts internally and then is expressed externally. Liberty begins internal first, and then it can be expressed politically, economically, in other ways. If people don't have internal freedom or internal liberty, their churches are not going to experience freedom. Their families won't have freedom. Their churches won't have freedom. Their state won't have freedom. Does that make sense? It's something very key that you'll realize, especially next year when we study universal history or ancient history, and we start studying some of the older nations. You're going to realize that when the people are bound by sin, their government is bound by sin. And we can even look in the United States today. As people become less and less self-governed, there are more and more regulations, more and more rules. The more self-governed you are, which means the more internal liberty you have, the less external controls there are, the less laws that there have to be. We're going to remember that. We're going to be thinking about that a lot. Okay? So let's go over the definition of history. It's written right there. It is an account of facts. An account means a record. An account of facts. Now notice it says facts. It's not lies. Okay, there are a lot of history books written today about all kinds of things, and they're full of lies. They do not give facts. They give thoughts and opinions, not facts. Facts are things that actually happened. I am losing my hair. That's a fact, right? It's not, I could say, man, I think my hair is going to grow long and I'm going to have nice flowing locks. That's a theory and a pipe dream. That's not facts. Facts are things that actually are true, okay? So now it's particularly of facts respecting nations or states. Now remember, when we talk about God working, is God working in the lives of men and nations. History deals with states and nations, okay? Now notice a narration of events in the order in which they happened. That means we go first, second, third, fourth, fifth. We don't go over here and then jump back 20 years and then go ahead 30 years. We want to make sure that we deal with history at a correct pace. So as you'll notice, we're going to start early on with Moses, and we're going to move through history, starting in Asia. We're going to move through history into Europe, and then from Europe, we're going to move into the Americas, and then we're going to move into World War I, World War II, French Revolution, those types of things, but we're going to do them in the order. So it's a narration of events in the order in which they happened. Now, why do we need to make sure that they're in the order in which they happened? Because look at the next part, with their causes and effects. If we don't know history in its proper order, then we don't know which is the cause and which is the effect. The cause is primary, the effect is secondary, right? If I get a black eye, what's the cause of that? Someone punching me. The cause is someone punched me, the effect is my black eye, correct? Hopefully that won't happen. But that's why we give this narration of events in the order in which they happen, so that we can see cause to effect. If we see something bad happen, like last year we talked about Mao, right? And he was one of the dictators in China. 100 million people probably died of starvation. That was an effect. What was the cause of that? Right? If we just study random facts and there's no order to them, how are we ever going to figure out why the mass starvation happened in China? Okay? So it has to be the order in which they happen so that we can see something that happens and we can look back and say, this happened because of this. Or for you, this happened because of this. Okay? So down there, there's two spots, two dots. The first dot is history deals with two things. Beside the first dot, I want you to see if you can notice it. What is it? An account of facts, particularly facts representing what? Nations. So the first point is nations. So write nations on that first dot. And what's the second thing that history deals with? It's bolded for you. Events. History deals with nations and events. Okay? And the events in which they happen. Go to the next page. Now, where does history come from? In the beginning, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning who? In the beginning God. What did God do? God created the heaven and the earth. When did history start? When did the history, and we're not talking about the history of God, we're talking about the history of man. When did the history of man start? It started with whom? It started with God. I'm trying to find my pages here so I can be in order. Okay? History started with God. So Genesis 1:1. He says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. I am the Lord. Revelations 1:8. Okay? God is the historian. He's the one who's writing the history. He's giving us the account of the facts and in the order in which they happened. In the Bible, we see the order of things happening in creation. Now, some of the prophets and stuff are kind of mixed up and everything like that. But in the very beginning, it's the order of what happened. In Acts, look at the book of Acts. It gives us the order of what happened. In the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see the promised Messiah. We see him coming. We see him growing. We see his miracles. We see him dying. We see him resurrecting. And we see him doing what? Telling them to go spread the gospel, right? The order in which they happened. Those are very important. Now, we're going to do a study on Moses later on. And Moses is going to be one of the key individuals that we study because Moses was very important in giving us the law. So let's look at your page where it says history. All right. History up there. You see that where it says history? Now, it gives you the definition again. An account of facts, particular facts respecting nations or states, a narration of events in the order in which they happened with their causes and with their effects. Okay? So let's look at biblical origin. Now, what does origin mean? Origin means where it came from. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1:1. So right across there, you have a line, and I want you to write one idea that you get from that. Dealing with history. So I expect you to reason through. It could be God is the author of history. Or when God created the earth, history began. Something to that effect. Does that make sense? If God is the origin and he is the beginning place of everything, then history naturally begins with him. Notice what it says here, the second verse. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord. He who is, he who was, and who is to come. The Almighty, Revelations 1:8. So, write one idea right beside that as well. So you should have two ideas in this section. In this section right here, you should have two ideas. One for this verse and one for this verse. We're going to write an idea per section. Does that make sense? So pull out a key idea from I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord. Now, I want you to notice that on a timeline, we have a beginning, don't we? But do we have an ending on our timeline? We have no ending on our timeline, do we? God's history. We don't know when God started, and he definitely will not end when God started. We know that he didn't start, so we have no idea of how long he's existed before the earth was even created. He could have been alive 200 gazillion years before he created. I mean, who knows? Your mind can't comprehend that God has always existed since forever. He was never created. He's always existed. So that's pretty cool. So what are some of the biblical purposes of history, right? Why do we have history? Why do we study history? I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old. Isn't telling history things of old. If I say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, isn't that something old, a dark saying? Not dark as in evil, but dark as in long time ago, right? It's an old thing. We which heard and known as our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from our children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. What is right there gives us an example of why we study history, to do what? So you can write something beside that. So I want you from this section right here, we will not hide them from our children, showing to the generations to come the praises of the Lord, his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. What is one of the purposes of history? From that one little section right beside it, so in that one section right here, I want you to write something that has to do with that. Don't worry about up here. We're dealing with this one, okay? I'll let you know when to write. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children. If you don't know what happened, how are you going to communicate that to anybody? Every night, Jude says, tell me a story of when you were little. Actually, he says, read a story when you were little, is what he tells me. And he wants me to tell him a story of when I was young, when I was a kid. I am remembering these things, right? From a long time ago. You'll get there one day. You'll be like, oh yeah, I remember when I was 15 or 16 and I did this, this, and this. Don't worry, you'll get there one day. But you have to remember things. You learn history not so you can have a bunch of facts and a bunch of ideas in your head. Yeah, it's good to have knowledge. It's good to be smart. It's good to know how the world works. But it's so that you can know the truths in your heart. And one day when you're a parent, you can teach those ideas and those truths to your children, right? What you're doing right now is preparing you for when you're adults. So that when you're an adult and you're out in the world and lies come and deceit comes and evil things come, guess what you're going to do? You're going to remember them, right? And hopefully one day help your children to know those as well. Notice what it says, that the generation to come might know them, which is what? The works of the Lord, even the children who should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. Meaning you should know them. Your parents should teach you. You should teach your children, and your children should teach their children. How far does God expect the knowledge of him to go? Does he expect it just to stop with you or with your children? No, he wants it to go from generation to generation to generation. We learn history so that we're able to teach our children and others about the mighty works of God. If you don't know what God did, then how in the world can you tell anybody about God? Right? If you go through a hard time and you have no idea about God able to do great things, how are you going to have any trust in God to do great things for you in your life? Robert E. Lee said, history teaches us to hope. As we see God's hand working, overruling, overseeing, disposing, right? As we see him doing those four things, it gives us hope knowing that God can protect us, that God watches out for us. It helps us trust in God's providence. Now notice what it says here, the second part, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. That is an important point. So I want you to write something beside that part. So I want you to write something beside, we will not hide them from their children. And next to this one, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. There's three things in there. There's three purposes for history there. And I want you to write down those three things right next to it. What three things does this tell you to do? Okay? Because as you study history, as I teach you history this year, it's going to help you to do these three things. If you allow the truths to penetrate your heart, penetrate your mind, and you truly learn. Now notice what it says in the next part. And might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and a rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with him. Notice that God is speaking here, and he's saying the children who did not know the works of God, what were they like? They were a stubborn, a rebellious generation whose hearts were in the wrong place and whose spirits were not with God. Can that be the effects of not knowing history? If that's the effects of not knowing history, that you are going to be stubborn, that you're going to be rebellious, that your heart's not going to be right with God, and you're not going to walk with God, then I think history is pretty important. because history teaches us how God works and works in the lives of men and nations. So that brings us to put our trust in him. Through history, we're going to know God. Through history, we're going to know who God is, how he operates, and man, are we going to be amazed at God? Are we going to love God more than ever before? It's pretty awesome. Let's go on to the next part. Now, notice that there were two things, nations and events. So here on your next page is we have biblical principles for nations. And I'm going to have you write one idea for this entire section. So for this entire section, we're going to read all this. And I want you to write one or two sentences explaining this. And then for this one, I'm going to have you just explain these as well. So let's read that together. God, who made the world and all things in it, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with man's hands, though he is needed, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth life to all, and breath and all things. And listen to this, hath made one blood all nations of men to dwell in the face of the earth. Notice what it says. One blood, all nations of men. That means it doesn't matter what color skin we are, we're all of the same blood. People make big deals. There's riots and things happening right now because we don't want to accept other people. No, even though they're the same as we are, they have the same blood in their veins. We all came from Adam and Eve. We all came from Noah. We're all distant cousins, right? The Asian guy in the tip of India and the Peruvian and the North American, the white guy in Canada who gets no sun, right? They're all related. They all have the same blood. God's made us all one, and man is seeking to divide. This is an important thing. Think if we realize that we're all equal. We're all valuable. We all are important to God. How are we going to treat each other? Notice what's happening. There's a stubborn and rebellious spirit in the world right now happening in our country because we're not putting biblical principles in practice. We're not remembering history, that God made all of us, that we're all equal, we're all valuable. Ideas have consequences, students. And it's God who gives life. He made one blood, all nations of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. God gave the earth for us to dwell in. And he has determined the bounds of their habitations. Now, the bounds of their habitations means borders. God has determined the borders of the nations. Do you see God, what is it, setting in order, right? Disposing, isn't that setting in order? He's made boundaries for nations. Do you think that the United States has those boundaries because that's how it happened? And that France has its boundaries because that's how it happened? And Russia has its boundaries because that's how it happened? No way! God's ruling and overruling in those things. He's setting in order. He's superintending in those positions. He gives each nation its own boundaries and its own borders. And why? Why does he create borders on nations? That they might seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him. He has those things so that we can seek God, so we can search him out. People come from all over the world with all the difficulties and all the things that America is doing wrong. People still come from all over the world to America. And it's not glorifying America and glorifying all this. It's glorifying what God did because there's principles here that allows people to know him. They come to America and they have freedom of religion. They can hear about Jesus. In China, they can't hear about him very well. Here, they can hear about him everywhere. There's there's churches on every corner. And notice what he says. Though he is not far from every one of us, for in him we live, we move, and we have our being. So here we have the idea of nations. The origin, the biblical principles, the origin of history and the biblical principles is history for nations. That nations are to be across the face of the earth. We're not all supposed to be one giant nation. All right? It's supposed to be multiple nations. God loves diversity. Look at how he created people all different. Even in our own state here, we have people from all over, every different color, every different size, every different shape, different languages. And God loves each one of them because we're all one blood. And he brought us together to be able to seek him. So I want you to write one idea about nations there. Now notice there's a second thing is events. Now events always happen, so when you say time and events, they always happen at a certain time. So notice we're saying time and events, okay? To everything there's a season and a time and a purpose, and a time to every purpose under heaven. I mean, God plans out his day. God plans out history. How many of you got up and say, okay, you have a calendar. Okay, on Monday I got to do this. On Tuesday I got to do this. At 3 o'clock on Friday I've got to do this, right? You schedule, you plan things. You have times for events. Well, so does God. And God said Rome is going to last from this time to this time, and Greece is going to last from this time to this time, and America is going to start in 1776, and it's going to go until I don't know when. You're born this time, and you're going to die this time. God knows, right? He's not caught by surprise. There's a time for to every purpose under heaven. Every nation, every person has a purpose and a time. And if we realize that, it makes what we do more valuable, because you're not just living for yourself. Guess what? All of a sudden you realize I'm living for God. God has a purpose for me for this short time I'm here. I mean, if you consider all eternity, let's just say that eternity, let's just say this is eternity, right? When we die, we go into eternity. For example, we start eternity here. And let's just say that here was 10 billion years. I mean, what is your spec of, let's say you were born, let's say this is when you died. Let's say you were, where would you be born? Would it be something like maybe when your life started would be like maybe right here somewhere? So there's this little bitty dot. It's probably even smaller than that. This is your life, 70, 80, 90, maybe 100 years. And it's going to set the course for the rest of eternity. 100 billion years, 100 trillion years, 100 decillion years. I think that's what, something like 10 zeros or something, I don't know, 30 zeros. That's a long time. But he's given you a short period of time to do what he's called you to do. Let's go to the next verse. But when the fullness of time was come, that means at the right time, God sent forth his Son, made of woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. God said, at the perfect time, you got the picture up here of Jesus. At the perfect time, Jesus came. He did not come too late. He did not come early. Man, this event, the most important event in history that ever happened or will ever happen, happened at the exact time it was supposed to happen. Now that's cool, because nothing can deter God's plan. You know, we talked about Jonah. Even Jonah couldn't get away from God's plan, right? He didn't really. He couldn't get away from it, could he? All right. At the perfect time. So write something right beside that one. Something about the time of God. In your life, certain things might not happen when you want them to happen. And you have a choice. Are you going to be mad? Or are you going to say, you know what, Lord? I know that you have a perfect time for every event of my life. Are you going to trust God? Man, see, it's easy to talk about it, but man, when it happens and you're faced with that situation of, oh man, what I wanted didn't happen. What I was hoping for didn't happen. What I prayed for to happen didn't happen. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means it's not time, right? What if I were to pray, say, God, please give me 4 wives? Do you think God's going to answer that prayer? Of course not. It's prayer and a time. But if I were to say, God, please help me get a new vehicle. I need a new vehicle. My old one is broken down and I need a new one. And a month passed, no vehicle. 2 months passed, no vehicle. 3 months passed, no vehicle, right? Guess what? I've been there before. That happened to me once. I was praying for almost 2 years for a new vehicle. And I had the choice. We could get mad, or we could trust in God's providence. And guess what? When God moved, I didn't even have to pay for the vehicle. Someone gave it to me. He paid for everything. I got a free vehicle. It's that Traverse I'm driving out there. I didn't pay 1 penny for it. But you know how long I prayed? You know how long Miss Sarah and I prayed? Probably 2 years. Trusting God, Lord, we need a new vehicle. Our vehicle has so many miles. It's as many miles as it is from the earth to the sun. I could have driven to the moon, or not the sun, The sun is 93 million miles away or something like that. I could have driven there, but to the moon. I had enough miles on my van to have driven basically to the moon. Remember that? I don't know if you all remember, but it was that van I had a couple years ago. Not the big red one. It was the other one. Right? The big red one was close though. It had a ton of miles on it, but I prayed. And I had the choice for those 2 years. That's a long time. That's 24 months. That's 700 and some odd days. Trusting God. Lord, we know that at the right time, you're going to give me something. And so we had to choose. And so when you learn from history that God moves, that he has a time for every event in your life, it gives you hope. You can trust him to take care of those things that you need. Because you've seen in history that God has moved. You've seen in history that God does come through, that God is providential. He cares, he protects, he watches over his children. He watches over his creation. Right? At the perfect time, God sent forth Jesus, his son, to bring salvation into the world. That's great stuff. And you know what? God can bring whatever you need at the right time. But sometimes we got to learn to trust him. All right. I think down that part, where it says rudiments of history, give me some ideas of what you think of, just write some ideas here of what you think about nations. What are some biblical principles from here that we learn about nations? What are some biblical principles here that we learn as well? So here you're going to interpret what you said or what was read and give one idea of what was said here. But here you're going to write down certain facts. So for nations have what? For example, it says, for nations, it says, God hath determined their bounds, right? Okay, what are some other ideas? What about in order and cause and effect in those? So just write some of those ideas down there, all right? They don't have to be long. Just give me 1 or 2 bullet points. That's okay. Now, let's go to the next page. Subjects of history. Now, we notice there's the arrows. One side is nations, and the other side is events, which is the works of God. So in the middle of those two things, you have nations. Let me get my eraser. Why don't you take your pencil or your pen? You have nations on this side. You have events on this side. And right in between those, I want you to write the works of God. You can put a box around it if you want to. History is the work of God. He works through nations, and he works through events. Okay? Now, we got a list under nations. So God-given habitation. All right? And these are some ideas that you can put on that previous page as well if you wanted to. All right? So, the first one is geography. Geography, right? God-given habitation. Where they live. Now, with Mr. Pullman, you're probably studying the definition of geography, and the geography is the separation of places, artificial and man-made, or artificial and natural. There's certain natural boundaries that God has created, which is water and land. If you look at a map, you see two things. You see land and you see water, right? But there's also artificial separations, and those could be borders, all right? We need to know where our borders are. At your house, you need to know where the border is around your property so you know where to cut and what you can do on your property. I can't go, if I live next to you, I can't go into your side of the property and cut down a tree that I don't like because it's on your property. So there has to be some type of geography for nations. There has to be some type of border so they can know where their authority is located, because their authority cannot operate somewhere else. America's authority cannot operate in Mexico. Right? That's one of the reasons we have the border, because Mexico's laws don't operate here. Our laws don't operate in Mexico. Same for the United States with all the different states. We have to have a border around California so that we can know where California ends and where Nevada starts. Right? Or where Mexico starts, because there's Mexico here. We have to have a border around Florida so we can know Florida's here, and here's the border, and here's Georgia, and here's Alabama. We got to know those types of things. Texas is beside New Mexico, and it has Oklahoma, and it has Arkansas and Louisiana. By the way, this year in geography, you guys are going to memorize all the states, I think, so that's going to be pretty cool. You're going to learn where they all are. That's going to be exciting. All right, so there's geography. Then there's the origin. The next line, write this out. Origin. The origin of each nation, which means the intent, the reason for existence, or the purpose. Did God have a purpose for Israel? You better believe he did. Does God have a purpose for the United States? Yes, he does. Does God have a purpose for Mexico? He certainly does. Does God have a purpose for Canada? Yes. Every nation has a purpose. Next thing dealing with nations is going to be the character of the people. Right? The character of the people. Those qualities or those attributes which are causative to actions. Americans are extremely generous people. When the tsunami hit the islands a couple years ago in Asia, America sent more money via private donations. This wasn't the federal government sending money. It was private donations, people giving to Red Cross and Salvation Army and a bunch of these other nonprofit organizations. America sent more money to those nations than all the rest of the world combined. Right? That's one of the characters of Americans. Most Americans are very generous, kind people. Now, do we have mean people here? Do we have selfish people here? Yes, we have selfish people everywhere. Does that mean only American people are generous and kind? No, there's generous and kind people in every single country because God's always working. But what I'm saying is, one of the character of qualities kind of as a whole in America, the majority of people are generous. Okay? The majority of people are kind. Yeah, there are always mean people out there. Now, notice this also. This leads to the next one, which is the form of government. Each nation has borders. Each nation has a way it started. Each nation has a character of the people, and that character of the people determines their form of government. How those people are going to be governed. What's their political ways of doing things. And years ago, France, England, Spain, all these people had what? Monarchies. So look down here. Monarchical, that means king or free, one of two forms or a mixture of the two, the effect of the national character, right? So there's different forms of government. You know, we hear democracy, we hear republic, we hear all kinds of things, right? But these are the ideas dealing with nations. So as we study history, we're going to see these. We're actually, especially when we get into ancient history next year, we're really going to be studying. And the cool thing is studying history now and looking at nations now, we know when nations began, but the nations that are here now, we don't know when they ended, right? But studying history, we can see nations that begin, and we can see nations that end, and we can say why they ended. We can have an idea. We can see the cause, and we can see the effect. But we'll see the geography, origin, character of people, and form of government. We see that with every single nation. Now over here, under events, let me erase this a little bit. Over here under events, we have different things. It's in order, which we wrote before. And we could do, this could be, so just write in order. That would be like timelines. In our timeline, here I'll lean this back a little bit, but in the timeline up here, are the events in order? Yeah, look, notice, get my head out of the way. Creation is first, and at the very end we have, what is it? Clip and the iPhone and, you know, the Twin Towers and stuff like that. Our timeline is in order, and there's a purpose for that, okay? So that's why we build timelines, and you're going to build some timelines this year. Okay, and then of course we have the last one, which is causes and effects. All right, causes and effects. The principles of character, conscience, and government. So notice that events happen because of the character of the people. We're going to study the French Revolution this year, and you're going to see the atrocities and the evil and the murder that happened in France because of the character of the people. And we're going to be able to contrast that with the American Revolution, okay? And we'll differentiate both of those. And it's not, like I said, that America is the most wonderful, greatest country in the history of the world. right? Which it is a great country, but it's not praising America. It's praising what God's done, because America would not be as wonderful as it is. It would not be the most generous nation it is. It would not be so excellent, even with all that's happening, if God had not been moving, right? So it's very important to understand that nations deals with this, events deals with these things. So as we study history, we're going to keep an eye out for these 4 points and these points, and we're going to be studying those in depth, okay? That's what I got for today. This will be the last video this week. I'll have 2 or 3 videos next week, and next week we're going to be delving into, just to let you know, we're going to talk about the pagan idea of man, the Christian idea of man, and individualism and individuality. What's the difference between individualism and individuality? So tomorrow's going to be another fun week. But take this, now you see how God works. Now you understand the rudiments of history, and we're going to get into more and more things later on. All right, students, have a great one.